The coat told the whole story before he even opened his mouth. It was a November morning in Edmonton, the kind where the cold arrives without warning, and the sky sits low and gray like a ceiling about to fall. Stuart McLean stepped out of a 2003 Dodge Ram that had seen better decades. The truck was the color of dried rust and old ambition. One of the headlight housings was cracked and taped over with clear packing tape. The tailgate was held shut by a bungee cord looped through a bolt hole that had no business being there. Steam rose from a travel mug held against the steering wheel as he parked, one level underground in a parkade that had a posted minimum vehicle age limit that nobody enforced, but that everyone seemed to understand applied to trucks like his. He was 43, his face had the particular look of someone who has learned to hold a lot quietly. Not sadness exactly, more like ballast, weight carried low, close to the center, invisible unless you knew where to look. He wore a work coat, insulated flannel over a button-down, the kind sold at outdoor supply stores in the mid-2000s, and built to last 20 years because they always did. The elbows were worn pale. The collar had a small iron-shaped burn on one side that Lena would have fixed, once. She'd been gone 4 years now. A black ice morning on the Whitemood, February, a semi that couldn't stop in time. Their daughter Chloe was 9 when it happened. She was 13 now. Stuart had not planned to be in this building today. He had not planned for any of this really. 6 months ago he was a structural assessment consultant working out of a 2-room office above a print shop in St. Albert, driving out to sites across northern Alberta in the Dodge, billing by the project, eating lunch from a cooler he packed before dawn so he could get Chloe to school on time. He was good at what he did, better than good. He had a particular gift for identifying load-bearing failures in large infrastructure before they became catastrophic. The kind of flaw that accountants miss because it doesn't show up on spreadsheets, and that architects miss because it doesn't show up until a wall moves in a way walls were never supposed to move. 3 months ago, someone at Harwell Group had forwarded his name to someone else. And now he was here. Harwell Properties was one of the 3 largest commercial real estate development firms in Western Canada. Their Edmonton Tower, 42 stories of glass and steel, currently mid-construction on 104th Avenue, had developed what their internal team called an anomaly, and what Stuart, after reviewing their documentation for 8 hours straight at his kitchen table while Chloe slept, called a staged composite failure waiting to happen. The original engineering firm had used a load distribution model that worked on paper and almost nowhere else. If the building proceeded as designed, sections 3 and 7 of the upper structural frame would begin exhibiting stress fractures within 18 months of occupancy. It would not collapse, not immediately, but it would shift, settle wrong, and eventually cost the firm somewhere between $60 and $90 million in remediation, if they caught it early, more if they didn't. He had written a 12-page preliminary report. They had asked him to present it to the senior partners. He was 10 minutes early. Standing at the main entrance of the Harwell Group headquarters, a building in the Oliver district with the kind of facade that said money, without saying anything so blunt. Stuart checked the address against the email on his phone, straightened the collar of his work coat, and walked in. The lobby was the temperature of a place that had never once considered the existence of November. A young woman at the reception desk looked up, took in his coat, his jeans, his boots, the practical kind with composite toes, and arranged her expression into the neutral professionalism of someone trained not to react. Stuart McLean, I have a 10 o'clock with the partners. She found his name, printed a visitor badge, and directed him to the 7th floor. He did not notice the woman watching from the other end of the lobby. Renata Holbrook was 51, Chief Operating Officer of Harwell Group, and one of 3 people whose signature went on every major contract the firm issued. She had come up through commercial development the hard way, 2 decades of decisions, negotiations, and the particular discipline required to manage large capital at speed. She was precise, demanding, and almost never wrong about people. She had a talent for reading a room before entering it, for knowing within 30 seconds whether someone sitting across from her was worth the time. She watched Stuart cross the lobby toward the elevators and felt something that rarely happened to her. Immediate dismissal. The coat, the boots, the truck she had seen in the visitor footage on the security screen while getting coffee. Whatever this person was here to present, it could not possibly be what they needed. She made a call. 2 minutes later, a facility manager named Craig, not in the file, Craig was not important except for what he set in motion, came downstairs and arranged for the Dodge to be moved from the visitor bay to the service lot on the building's west side. Not towed, moved. Craig was polite about it. He told the parking attendant it was blocking a delivery corridor that didn't actually need the space until Thursday. Stuart didn't know yet. He stepped into the boardroom on the 7th floor at 9:58, notebook under his arm. A plain black one, spiral-bound, the kind sold in 3 packs. 3 senior partners were already seated. One was reviewing something on a tablet, another was pouring water. None of them stood. "Mr. McLean," said the one at the head of the table, a man named Douglas Prent, managing partner, late 50s, the kind of man who had the handshake of someone who wanted you to know the handshake was deliberate. "We've looked over your preliminary notes before we begin. Can you take us through your methodology?" Renata entered 3 minutes later and sat at the far end of the table, without introducing herself to him. She opened a leather portfolio and began reviewing something that clearly had nothing to do with the meeting. The message was not subtle. Stuart noticed. He said nothing. He opened his notebook. He did not use slides. He had been asked whether he needed the display screen, and he had said no. That had already confused 2 of the partners. He had a hand-drawn diagram, photocopied onto 3 sheets, which he distributed without ceremony. Then he started talking. He talked about composite shear walls, and what happens when load paths are modeled on uniform distribution assumptions, rather than actual site-specific soil compaction data. He talked about sections 3 and 7. He talked about what the original engineering team had likely been thinking, and exactly where their model diverged from what the geology of that particular lot in Edmonton's river valley would actually do to a 42-story steel frame over time. He used numbers, but not many. He used physical logic instead, the kind you could see, follow, feel intuitively, the way a doctor explains a fracture not with the radiology report but with their hands. Douglas Prent leaned forward at minute 11. The partner to his left, a woman named Judith Caro, whose title was Director of Structural Risk, whose job was to tell the firm when to worry, picked up the photocopied diagram and studied it. Renata did not look up from her portfolio. At minute 17 Judith asked the first real question. It was a good question, technical and direct, the kind you only ask if you actually understood what you just heard. Stuart answered it without hesitating. He had anticipated the question, he had anticipated the 3 that followed it. By minute 24, Douglas had stopped taking notes and was simply watching. Renata looked up at minute 27, not obviously, just enough. Then she looked back down. By the time Stuart closed his notebook, quietly, no drama, the way you set down a tool when the job is done, the room was holding the specific kind of silence that follows collective recalibration. Not awkwardness, recognition. The kind where everyone at the table has just revised something they thought they understood about the person in front of them. Douglas said, "What would it take to bring you on as the lead structural consultant for the remediation?" There was a pause, then Judith added, "Before you answer that, what's your timeline? Can you start in January?" Stuart said he could discuss terms. He said he'd need to think about scope and exclusivity. He said there were a few other projects he'd have to restructure his commitments around. He spoke calmly, without urgency, because the urgency was theirs, not his. Then he said, "I'll also need to leave by 3:15, I have to pick up my daughter from school." Douglas nodded. "Of course. I drove today. I should let the parking attendant know I'll be staying past noon." Judith glanced at the admin assistant hovering near the door. The assistant looked at his phone. Something shifted in the assistant's expression. He stepped out. 3 minutes later, he returned and approached Renata's end of the table. He leaned down and spoke quietly. Renata's chin stopped moving. She looked up. For the first time all meeting, she looked directly at Stuart. Then she looked at Douglas. Douglas said carefully, "There seems to have been a miscommunication about parking." The room already knew. Rooms like this one always knew within seconds. The assistant had made a call. The call had confirmed what everyone was now inferring. The COO had arranged to have the consultant's vehicle relocated without his knowledge or consent. Stuart was quiet for a moment. He looked at his notebook, then at Douglas. "Where is it now?" The assistant said it had been moved to the service lot. It wasn't towed, it was accessible. He could get it right now if he needed. Stuart nodded once. I'll need it back where it was before I leave. His voice was level, not cold level, the way a man speaks when he has long since learned that anger is expensive and clarity is free. Renata stood. She walked to his end of the table. She stood in the space between chairs and the window, and she said his name. Not Mr. McLean. Stuart, as though they were already past formality, because they were, now, though not in the way she had anticipated when she walked in. I owe you an apology, she said. That was my call. It was wrong. There was no qualifier at the end of that sentence. No, because I thought or I didn't realize, or I understand how it must look. Just, it was wrong. The room noticed. Stuart looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. Small, once okay, he said, that was all. No magnanimity speech, no accepted, and I hope we can move forward. Just, okay. Which, somehow said more. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. By the end, Douglas had drafted a framework agreement on his tablet. Judith had already emailed the original engineering firm's lead contact to arrange a site review. The admin assistant had brought Stuart's truck back to the visitor bay and had it moved to the covered section near the entrance. At 3:07 p.m., Stuart McLean buttoned his work coat, picked up his spiral-bound notebook, and took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, the receptionist who had looked at his coat that morning now smiled at him, with a different quality of attention. The kind that follows when context changes everything. He stepped outside into the November cold and found the Dodge exactly where it should have been. Someone had left it running to warm up. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before putting it in reverse. The heater rattled the way it always did at startup. There was a drawing on the passenger seat. Chloe's, from last week's art class. A horse with wings, done in orange marker, because it was her favorite color. He had meant to move it inside but hadn't. He was glad he hadn't. He pulled out of the lot and drove north toward St. Albert. Chloe was standing at the school pickup line when he arrived, backpack on, talking to someone from her class. She looked up when she heard the distinctive rattle of the engine. She always heard it before she saw it, and she grinned in the unself-conscious way that 13-year-olds still do when they're not yet performing for anyone. She climbed in. You look weird. Did something good happen? Maybe, he said. Did you get the job? Close to it. She considered this with the seriousness of a person who understood what close to it meant in their house. Then she reached into her backpack and produced a granola bar, the kind with chocolate chips, the good kind, and held it out without saying anything. He took it. They drove home down the highway, as the sky went orange and flat behind the river valley, the truck rattling, the heater doing its best, and the late daylight making the whole familiar drive look briefly like something worth remembering. 3 weeks later, Stuart signed a consulting agreement with Harwell Group, worth more than he had earned in the previous 4 years combined. He restructured 3 smaller contracts, negotiated an office near home so he could still make the school pickup, and began work on what would become the most significant infrastructure remediation project in Harwell's histories. He did not replace the truck. He had the transmission rebuilt. He fixed the headlight housing and replaced the bungee cord on the tailgate with an actual latch. He bought Chloe new skates for Christmas, the good kind, the kind she had never asked for because she knew better than to ask. On the first day of the remediation project kickoff, a morning meeting in late January, the temperature outside sitting at -22, he pulled into the Harwell visitor lot at 9:50. He parked in a space near the entrance. No one moved his truck. Renata Holbrook passed him in the lobby on the way to the elevators. She stopped. Good morning, Stuart. Good morning, he said. They took the same elevator up. Neither of them mentioned November. Some things didn't need to be said more than once, and some apologies, the real ones, lived in what came after. In a parking space undisturbed, in a contract earned and honored, in the particular care that follows the recognition of a mistake. That morning, on the floor of the Dodge's cab, still in its orange marker lines, was Winged Horse. It had been there since October. Stuart had decided it could stay.